Okay, a little bit about me. My name's Charles. I have a career and I'm sometimes a grown-up, but in my spare time, I'm fascinated by old buildings. And weirdly enough, I actually love garages and I love warehouses and I search for abandoned property. Uh, I think I fit into the nerd night category because I am nerdy. I like a technical detail and I like the searching, the researching, the detective work. Um, Today I'm hoping to tell you a bit about squatting and I think the useful part of squatting is to learn how to be successful. So thanks to the organisers for having me here. I'm going to try and cover, in the spirit of Nerd Night, a few technicalities. I'm going to try and cover the law, the basics of what you need to know, the skills you need, and I'll give you some examples as well. In the short term, with abandoned property, if you are successful squatting, you can make money from the property. And if you're a successful squatter long term, it's possible to end up as the new owner of the property. Nick, onto the next slide, which is the law. The law essentially is the law of adverse possession. And Nick, if you could just click to the next slide. Adverse possession is a civil law that pitches the squatter against the true owner of a property. Adverse, in this case, means you're an adversary to the registered owner. If you're a squatter looking for property, when you find an abandoned property, you'll need to enter the property and try and take care of the building or land, try and improve it in some way, and try and make good use of it. A squatter can, while in possession of a building or land, can rent the building out, can use the building until the true owner evicts the squatter. So if a squatter is in a building where the true owner of the building has died, or the original owner of a building was a company that's folded, or an individual who doesn't challenge the squatter, and after 10 years of squatting property, the squatter can apply to be the registered owner. Nick, the next slide, please. In this example, this is a raggedy old garage that had a lot of rubbish in it and a graffiti covered door. The true owner has disappeared. Lots of work's been done with the land registry to try and track down the true owner. And the door's been painted blue, the rubbish has been cleared, and this garage is now rented to a random person. Next slide, please, Nick, back to the law. When the squatter is in occupation and in possession of a building or property, the squatter needs to prevent others from accessing the property. So the obvious thing is keeping it locked, or if you're squatting land, to erect a fence around it. Squatters can't be invited to be on the property. So a squatter can't be a tenant or happen to be living at the property. You have to be an adversary to the owner, and you can't be an adversary if you are a tenant of the owner. There's a famous case of failed claims for land. For instance, people claiming for woodland or common land in a village, saying, well, I use it every day, it's exclusively mine. If you haven't fenced it and you haven't excluded others in some way, you can't make a successful claim for it and you can't be a squatter. The squatter needs to show the land registry that they have made improvements to the building or to the land, as well as excluding others. So ideally, you, as a squatter, you have fixed the building in some way, fixed holes in the roof, repaired doors, improved windows in some way. Now, the law changed a few years ago, and it's now illegal to live in a squatted house. So it's now illegal to live in a squatted house, but you can still squat the house, adverse possess the house, and then once you fix it up, you can rent it out to other people who can live in it. So there's a bit of a loophole there. The only person that can evict a squatter from a property is the true registered owner of the property. Some things to note about the law. Next slide, please, Nick. This shop, by the way, is I've included pictures of here, is local to me in South London. These photos were all taken in the last week. cutting a lock or breaking a lock is criminal damage. So you need to be very careful about how this squatter needs to be careful how he or she enters a building. Um, the example of the picture here, you see the right-hand picture showing two very old rusty padlocks. The only way into this property is to cut these padlocks off. A good example of a workaround would be to come with the exact same padlocks. So once you've taken the old padlocks off, you put new padlocks on. If the police turn up while you are engaged in accessing the building, you would say, oh, well, you know, I've replaced the old padlocks with new padlocks. And if the true owner is available, I'll hand over the keys to that person. You know, there's ways of not being done for criminal damage on entering the property. And there's some technical aspects of the law that are quite interesting. There's not really a law, a UK law, that prevents you from entering a building. So you might have heard of breaking and entering. Breaking and entering isn't a law. It's just a myth. It's just a phrase we hear a lot. We have a criminal law called burglary, which is the act of entering a property to steal or to hurt someone. So if you're thinking of accessing an old building, an abandoned building, there's no such thing as breaking and entering for you to worry about. And as long as you're not trying to steal from the building or hurt anyone in the building, you can, in theory, access the building. The other law that applies in some cases is trespass. And this is also a misunderstood law in the UK. Trespass is essentially a claim for damages. So if I entered this shop and I was in the shop for a week in and out fixing things and improving things, I'm not trespassing. If I go in the shop and I damage something in the shop to the tune of £5,000, then there can be a claim for trespassing against me, and the end result of that is that I would have to pay the true owner £5,000. So there's nothing really in British law that prevents people from accessing property. Okay, Nick, on to the next slide, please. Okay, the skills you need to be a good squatter. The skills one needs to be a good squatter. And I think hopefully this level of detail applies to the Nerd Night crowd. You really need to be a very good detective. You need to track down property and spend a lot of time researching and finding out what you can about it. You need to be a researcher. And at some point, if you're prepared to go into one of these buildings, you also need to be brave. The first part of the job, though, is to find abandoned property. And out of the two houses in this slide, I've taken photos of in the last week or so. The one on the right is near Goodge Street Station, and the one on the left is in Camberwell. When I was young in the 80s, there were loads of abandoned houses in London, but you just don't find them at all anymore. There might be abandoned houses in other parts of the UK. I only look in London. They're a very rare thing. I cycle, I walk, and I constantly look whenever I'm out and about for property that could work. Squatter also needs to have a wide scope. So these two houses would be amazing properties to squat if you ever owned them, but I consider everything. So I look at warehouses, garages, yards, bits of property with fences, with weeds growing out of them, old abandoned industrial property. And if you're considering a squat, you need to be looking at the lock and the condition of the lock. Can you see rusted locks, old padlocks that haven't been touched for years, weeds growing through fences, holes in the roof? Once your detective work is done and you've found an appropriate property and you're thinking it might be worth squatting, the next thing is research. You need to go to the land registry to find the details of the owner of the building or the land. Has the owner died? The house on the left in this slide, the owner died last year. There's a property owned by a company that shut down. You need to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how the property's been left and what circumstances have led to it being in the condition it's in. I have a friend who's a squatter in a small Welsh town, and he's taken over a piece of land in the middle of his town. The locals are incredibly frustrated because he's effectively moved onto a piece of land that was abandoned for years and cleaned it up, cleaned the rubbish from it and put a fence up. He's done a lot of research, and he's discovered the original owner moved to Canada in the 70s and eventually drowned in a lake. So a perfect target for him, but not something that townsfolk are particularly happy about. When a squatter is comfortable that the property in question is definitely abandoned, it's time to cut off the lock or change the lock. Use a locksmith. You need to essentially get to a point where you're going to go into the property. And at the same time, it's worth adding a very visible, shiny new lock, just so that you are indicating to anyone walking past the property that there is some care being taken, some element of new lock has been put on to prevent people from having the same interest that you've got in a property. Once a squatter is inside the building, there's going to be lots of work required. So leaks, holes in the roof, damaged windows. I mean, you can see the house on the left has got boarded up windows on the ground floor. And at this point, the work you do on a property as a squatter is not money that you're ever going to get recovered if you get evicted. So it's best to not spend money at first. In the first 6 months of squatting a property, if someone's going to evict you, you tend to be in the first 6 months. That would be the first 6 months when you don't really do anything that costs you money. And you can patch up roofs with bits of plastic, use chipboard for various things. The idea is to improve a building without blowing your budget. You also need to be prepared to walk away from buildings. I've squatted around 25 buildings in the last 10 years, and I've been evicted or walked away from 23 of those. So even though you may research and do all the detective work at some point, you also need to be prepared to leave. Some property in the UK is still unregistered and won't show up on the land registry. Some of this property looks like it's fair game for squatting, but you need to be aware that, for instance, councils, Southwark Council, where I live, for instance, and Network Rail, for instance, are two large organisations that have a lot of unregistered property. Whenever I find old, abandoned, dilapidated warehouses alongside railway tracks, I assume it's now Network Rail, and I don't bother because Network Rail have never registered their trackside properties. In the past, I've learnt my lessons. I've entered property owned by various councils and improved it, cut down trees, fixed holes in roofs, and then normally at a time when the rental income starts coming in and when I've rented successfully property out, that's when the council turns up to evict me based on the fact that the neighbours rang them. Nick, if you could just go to the next slide, please. The house on the left, you can see a close-up of the padlock that's locking it. Is very flimsy and a bit pathetic, and this house is probably already being squatted by someone who hasn't put a lot of effort into putting the lock on. That lock is not really going to prevent anyone else getting in and is a bit flimsy. But Nick, if you could go to the next slide. House number 2 of the examples. If you look closely, the left-hand side of the door looks ragged and abandoned, but on the right-hand side of the door is this Ring doorbell. So even though I looked at this house and had a close look through the windows and inside it looks like a haunted house in some way, there's obviously something happening, some care being taken over it because the Ring doorbell shows it's not worth squatting. Okay, Nick, on to the next slide, please.
Are you still there, Tob? I think we might have lost him.
Hopefully.
Oh, there you go.
Nick can move on to the next slide when he's ready, and hopefully you can all still hear me. Thank you very much. Okay. I thought I would finish with an example of Nick. If you could go to the previous slide, please. Local to me in South London. The story of the property is that it's was once the back garden of a Victorian house. Probably in the early 20th century, it was a stable or an outbuilding, maybe with horses in it. In the 60s and 70s, people were repairing cars in it. And in the 90s, it was owned by an old man. I discovered recently he died 5 years ago. I tracked his address down from the land registry. He lives in Clapham. I went to see him, and the people living in the address where he now is, sorry, he previously lived, told me he died 5 years ago. The occupation of the building, the before picture on the left is sometime after I started clearing it. There were pieces of in a terrible state. I changed the look over the course of 5 years, and loads of rubbish, stuff that other people had dumped. I mean, it's been a long process. There were some rusty cars in there as well, which had to come out and were scrapped. And at some point, I replaced the rotten wood with new gates. Once I'd cleared it, Nick, if you go to the next slide, I also rented space inside it to an art student, and I rent space to someone who stores a car in there. And I'm currently in the process of claiming the property via the land registry, which involves some documented evidence of my use of the property and a couple of small surveys that the land registry carried out. In theory, if my claim is successful, the land registry will write to the true owner of the property. If I'm right, and 5 years ago, he won't respond. If he has family, it would be up to his family to respond, or a wife. But if there's no person looking after his estate, he won't respond. And in theory, the squatter, me, becomes the registered owner of the property. Okay. And Nick, the final slide, please.
I think that's frozen again. Nick, if you could stop sharing your slides for now. Let's see if that creates enough bandwidth to bring Charles back. And maybe these squatted buildings don't come with great broadband. Can you hear us, Charles? And can we hear you now? You're on mute for some reason. I don't know how. Still muted. Excellent. Yep. Okay. So yeah, sorry, we've had a bit of trouble with your internet connection. So we lost the last point I think you were making with your last slide. So if you could pick up from there, and then definitely we've got some questions from Evie.
Yeah, sure. So this is the, Nick, if you go to the before and after picture of the garage again. I was saying that around 11 years ago, I started clearing rubbish from this garage, changed the lock, and over 5 years or so, the most recent 5 years, cleared the rubbish from the property, replaced the rotten wood with new gates, rented space out to a student, and I now rent to someone who stores a car in there. The bicycles and things are my goods. So the final aspect of my trying to possess this property will be the process of claiming it via a claim to the land registry, which is in progress at the moment. Now, in theory, the land registry will write to the true owner of the property, who I believe is dead, having done the research. If the true owner doesn't contest the claim, then the squatter, becomes a registered owner. It's a long process, and hopefully a fair process based on the fact that some is a legitimate. Okay, and the last slide, Nick, please. So I think my girlfriend's take on my actions is that she believes I need to grow up. But I think squatting is an area where there's a lot of possibility and potential. If you think of all the abandoned property in the UK and various other places around the world, and a set of laws that are designed to effectively reward people for doing good research and making an effort and improving and fixing property, there's a lot of potential. If you have been in any way interested in what I'm saying, and don't regard me as some sort of criminal, and if you're interested in doing the same, I would encourage anyone to look locally. There are always, in every corner of the UK, there's always property that is abandoned. You might pass stuff every day thinking, oh, look at that old garage, look at that old shed, look at that old yard. The first part of the process of squatting really is the detective work and the researching. And that is interesting and fun, and doesn't require any significant action. You don't have to do anything criminal or dangerous or illegal. Just the process of finding out how property has become abandoned. Did a company fold? How has a company left this old warehouse? Where did the individual go? Who died? How did this property become the way it has? There's a website in London, Derelict London, and various people obsess about these old properties. They specifically say that they're not a research centre for squatting, but there's a lot of fascination with old properties generally. And for me, it's the fascination of not just what happened to this property, how did it become derelict, but what are the next steps? Could some action be taken to possess this property in some way? So I'd encourage each of you to look, research, and maybe take action. And thank you all for listening. And I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you. No, it really was. And there's been lots of questions in the chat coming through. So Evie, can I hand over to you?
Sure you can. Yes, we do have lots and lots of questions. Let's start with the really important one. And that is, can you end up with a criminal record?
Yeah, so you do need to be cautious of understanding the law and knowing the law. If you're trying to enter a building and you think the neighbours are going to call the police, when the police turn up, you need to be able to have a good story for them. And the story for me is, I'm entering this building because I'm a squatter, because I'm an adverse possessor. I haven't damaged anything. I've changed the lock, or I've used the locksmith to get in. And, here's my name and address. I'm not hiding anything. It's much better to access a building in broad daylight, obviously lunchtime, when people would not suspect you of doing anything, rather than going in at 4 o'clock in the morning like some sort of burglar. You also, I think, when I said people need to be brave, I have pushed through fences and gone through old doors. And at that point, when you're stepping into a building, you are doing something quite bold, and you should expect the police sometimes to be called. I've had the police around to my house a couple of times because I've gone looking for property with the sort of tools that make me look like a burglar, and the police have been called and have come around to the house. Why were you there with an angle grinder? Why were you at this garage with a crowbar? I was just looking. I'm just a potential squatter, just doing some research. So yeah, I mean, yes, you could end up with a criminal record, but the idea is to not end up with a criminal record.
Now, interesting one is, can someone squat a property that you are already squatting if they can get in?
Yeah, so the house, the left hand of those two houses that I showed earlier, has a very flimsy, weak padlock on it. And my guess is that looks like someone is squatting it, that someone has deliberately put that padlock on the front door, but not really put the effort in. If there is currently a squatter who's not inside the building, and I cut through that padlock and put a better padlock on, effectively I'm a squatter trying to displace an existing squatter. So as long as there isn't someone inside the building already, then yes, a squatter can take over from another squatter. And also the 10-year time frame that I mentioned, if one squatter has been in a building for 5 years and then a new squatter takes over, that time continues. So 2 squatters at 5 years each equals a 10-year time frame, and the claim can still be valid at that point.
Next question is, can you tell us about guardians and whether they are anti-squatting measures?
They are very, very important. There's a building opposite my house, which is a 4-storey Southwark Council-owned classroom block. It's part of an adult education centre. And I kept looking at it, thinking that would be a perfect squat, absolutely perfect. And then one day, 4 art students turned up, cut through the lock, went in and were squatters. And they lived in it. They had Apple Macs, and one of them had a Citroen 2CV outside. And they just lived in this property free for about 2 months. And then eventually they got evicted. Now the people living in this building are guardians. And in effect, the guardians are brought in when a building is an obvious target for squatting. Normally a commercial building, because nobody squats residential property anymore. So if it's a council-owned building that's big and looks like it could be an art student's dream, then normally the guardians will be invited in because the protection they offer is very high. Nobody would squat a property where there's people actively living in there and big signs all over the front saying guardians. So if you, like me, you look around London for old abandoned property, 99% of abandoned property now, if it's commercial, has guardians or something to tell you as a potential squatter that there is a day-to-day monitoring of this building. So yeah, the guardians are a very important tool to prevent people squatting your property.
Another question is, has the law changed in any way since COVID, to allow squatters remain for longer or anything like that?
I don't think the law has changed. The law is the civil part of the law is thousands of years old. I mean, I believe that squatting is a law, it's a hangover from Roman times. The law of squatting essentially, because it pitches the squatter against the true owner, whether under COVID or any other time, if you're in a building where you shouldn't be there, then the true owner really has to make an effort to get you out. Now, at the moment, you might find that takes longer because the court process is more difficult. So 2 years ago, you might have been able to evict a squatter in 2 or 3 weeks with a good small court, like if you go to court and you make an application. So under COVID, I know that some court actions are taking much longer to go through. If you have to apply to the court to get an order to evict people, the court might take 3 months instead of 2 weeks, which would be annoying. The building opposite my house that has now got the guardians in it, the legal process took 5 days from start to finish. So the council turned up, asked the people what they were doing, and 5 days later they got evicted. Now, if a council can manage to persuade a court to evict people in 5 days in non-COVID times, then maybe under COVID they've got the same power. So I don't exactly know, but yes, I know that the court system is overstretched.
Next question is a legal one. If someone dies, wouldn't the will or estate apply?
Yeah, so in a way, if you think about my interest in looking for property, I'm trying to find houses or any property where someone might have died where they probably had no living relatives. So yes, and most abandoned property where someone dies, you'd expect the relatives to turn up soon after and say, oh, this was Auntie Marjorie's house and now it's our house. As a squatter, my job is to try and find those properties where there are no living relatives. And there was a couple of years ago, someone mentioned to me, oh, there's a big house around the corner. I went to look at it. I went around the back and I climbed in through the back window, which was open. And it was a very old, dilapidated.
That is a cliffhanger from Charles. Let's give it a minute to see if he unfreezes.
Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, I think maybe we could hand presenting over to the cat, who's been really enjoying this. I guess is an essential squatter. Yeah, any sign of him? No. Oh dear. Maybe he can join the WhatsApp chat and answer questions after that. Well, yeah, I think on that basis, I'll take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone who has attended this evening. I think we mentioned it in the material when you're buying your tickets, but all proceeds from Nerd Night go to charity. So the money that you spend on your tickets tonight will donate to the Shine Trust, which provides educational opportunities for young nerds. So we're sort of you're helping to maintain the nerd pipeline. So thank you very much for that. Charles, you're back.
I'm back. Apologies.
So you were going through the window.
Sorry, say again.
You were going through the window when you froze.
Oh yes, yeah. So I climbed into the window of this house, and the house was truly dilapidated, and the guy didn't even have electricity. I went to speak to the neighbour and thought this would be a perfect opportunity for squatting an old abandoned property that was owned by a man who had died. I left the house for 2 weeks, and when I came back, I went around the back garden again, and I heard voices inside. So I banged on the front door, and there was the family of the man who had died. They'd been tracked down by a lawyer. So I said, "Oh, this is an amazing house, abandoned. I hear there was an old geezer living here." And they said, "Yes, that old geezer happened to be Uncle Freddie. We didn't even know we had an Uncle Freddie." So they'd effectively been tracked down by the lawyers who were responsible for finding long lost relatives.
Fascinating. How did you get into this? Did someone introduce you to this or trained you up?
If you can still hear me, just got into researching. I spent a lot of time in nerdy ways on the internet reading stuff and thinking about property that is, I live in a city where property is often inaccessible. I do remember a long time ago, I had a friend's older sister lived in an old mansion in Richmond, southwest, squatted house, and they spent a year there. I remember going around there in winter, and they'd taken up all the floorboards from the dance floor at the back of this house and burnt them to keep warm. That's not good squatting, by the way. That's very unpleasant squatting. But there was a time in London where houses were abandoned and people just moved into them. The Notting Hill Carnival of the 70s and 80s used to be have these enormous houses where people would put these speakers in the windows because they're effectively squats. Over the years, they've all been repossessed, but we live in an era where, if you do your research and you're lucky enough to find something, there's still things out there you can come across.
I think maybe last one. How long does the owner have to contest the claim?
So the owner, if the land registry receive a successful claim, and they judge it on a few things. So if you appear to be telling the truth and you've maintained the property, the land registry will write to the true owner, and the true owner has 3 months to respond. Now that 3 months, all they have to do is write back and say, "Yes, I've got the claim." That gives the land registry 2 more years, and they wait 2 years. So effectively, when you make a claim on a property, you have to have been there 10 years, but then the owner gets 2 more years to respond. And in that 2 years, I'm a reasonable person. The owner could turn up and say, "Please leave my building. I am here, no problem at all." Or they could have to go through maybe an expensive court process to get an eviction. But ultimately, if they don't respond for 3 months, the property will be put into the name of the squatter, provided the application meets the right criteria. 2 more years if they contest it in any way.
I think that's it. Or do we have one more, Louis? No time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, I feel like the internet connection, just as Evie said, added to the suspense a little. So thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers.